Good evening, everyone. I'm Shoma Chaudhury, one of the co-founders of Algebra. My colleague Payal is not well, and so she's not here. She's usually the one who starts all the welcoming and introduction. But the rest of us women in black are here in half strength. There's Nina, Ritu, Anjali, and Shuli, Rimjim, and Payal are back in Delhi for various reasons. But we're all in spirit here to welcome all of you. Thank you very much for being here. We were very worried to be clashing with the Bangalore Literature Festival. So it's particularly wonderful to see all of you here in such large numbers. And the Literature Festival also had large numbers. So a salute to the city and its commitment to intellectual conversations. You know, all evenings, of course, we have to first start with those who make it possible. And as we always say, you know, good ideas need good partners. So we're really delighted that what's made it possible for us to come here to Bangalore month on month with you is Jain Global Institute, a premier institute of education that has centers across the country. They are presenting partners and will be partnering with us through the year so that we are here with you every month. In addition, we are really glad that Tata Hitachi has partnered with us, and though they are in the business of construction and heavy lifting, I'm really glad that they've understood that all construction and heavy lifting must start with the mind. And there's also, of course, Phoenix Kesaku, premium living. Again, one of the core ideas of Algebra was really to reach out to a very elite audience, to create a sort of idea of life of the mind as being the most important aspect of any city. So again, it's wonderful that a real estate company, you know, with high living is partnering with us and understands that impulse for a life of the mind. Then, of course, we have the Leela Hotel, which is our partner in hosting all of you here, and who have declared that they really are wedded to us now. And we are delighted to be wedded to them because it's a wonderful location, makes it plausible for all of you to be here. And their general manager, Kunal Chauhan, is here, so a particular thank you to you. Wherever you're sitting. And then we have Glenlivet, which has really been a partner in crime with us from the beginning and ensures that we have become a very coveted and spirited community. And, you know, so particular thanks to them because they partner with us in all the 4 cities that we host editions of Algebra. And then there's Pepsi, of course, that is making pleasure a little less sinful. And we are very, very grateful to all of them. Before we start the evening, you know, there might be a few of you who are new here, and I'm beginning to get lambasted for saying this about Algebra every time. Those of you who've heard me say it before, forgive me. But everybody does end up asking, why Algebra? Why have you called this club Algebra? And why are you rousing the nightmares of our childhood? But it really is an Arabic word called Al-Jabr, and it has a beautiful meaning. It means the science of restoration and balance. And a great part of our attempt really is to create a discourse that allows for some degree of restoration and balance in our public life. It also means a coming together of broken parts. So in every way, its metaphorical meaning is wonderful. And we have 3 very, very riveting sessions coming up. I'd just like to tell you that we'll be starting with 2 sessions back on back with Ashish Kothari and Shashi Tharoor. There will not be a break in between these 2 sessions, so please don't get up in between. Both of them will be available for signing books during the cocktail break. And then after the cocktail break, we'll be back with Balki and Gauri Shinde. And of course, all the house rules about the phones and the cracks about giving us your commitment more than to your phones and allowing us to be more interesting than technology. So please do put your phones on silent. And of course, Shashi is here. I was going to relegate you to second speaker, but I'll put you back on first. And also, you do know that we are trying to build a community of memberships and members that will enable us to be sustainable. So if you're interested, please do go to the reception table. The membership boxes are there. And our next event is going to be on November 12th and December 10th. So that's just to give you a heads up. And now, of course, Shashi has already set the city on fire this afternoon by speaking at the Literature Festival. So let's at least keep some of those embers going. You know, with Shashi, you could talk to him for 4 hours, 5 hours, because he's such a polymath and has written on so many subjects and puts himself in the firing line of so many subjects that each of those could be a 1-hour conversation in itself. But today, because we have such a robust lineup, we're going to restrict him to a very short time. And so I thought that we'll really focus on 3 or 4 very big issues of our time. And that is the legacy of the ideas of India left by Nehru, who has become a very easy figure to revile. And I must say, and I'll declare myself in advance, that even if I'm not a Congress acolyte, I certainly am somebody who holds a great regard for Nehru. And I hope that one is able to discuss him to understand how a towering figure like him can become so easily reviled in our times. And Shashi has, of course, now written a book about Mr. Modi called The Paradoxical Prime Minister. And that is obviously a conversation that demands to be had, because it is a juxtaposition of Mr. Nehru and Mr. Modi, both leaders that have had huge sort of democratic votes behind them, to really look at the 2 legacies that the 2 leaders are creating. And the Constitution, what both men did with the Constitution, what they hope to do, where we stand vis-a-vis the Constitution, and if there's time, then ideas of Hinduism. So that's really the framework of the conversation that I hope to have. There's no point introducing Shashi except as being a catalyst, the flintstone that always starts a fire, and definitely someone that we are very grateful to have in our public life, because he remains civil and he remains committed to the idea of intellectual engagement. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Shashi Tharoor. I'm always told by the team which chair to sit on so that the speaker gets the better profile, and with Shashi, it's very important that he gets the better profile.
No, I don't think I've made that request, in all fairness.
So Shashi, as I said, thank you. In fact, thank you for writing this book on the Prime Minister, because it starts with a very interesting principle, which is that you've declared that as a true Democrat, even though you come from the Congress and you have a long history of having very entrenched liberal positions, that you were really willing to give Mr. Modi a chance. You know, you believed in the rhetoric that he was putting out, you had hope, you liked what he was saying, and you were willing to give him a chance. So before we get into why now you've written the book that you have, what was it about Mr. Modi that made you hopeful? Why don't you spell out what the attraction was?
Well, there were 2 things really. The first actually was simply respect for the electorate. As a Democrat, you have to admit that when the public that votes for a party to come to power has overwhelmingly rejected your party and elected somebody else, that at least in the immediate aftermath of that, you really must respect the electorate's decision, that they must have seen some good qualities, and therefore you feel it's important to actually show some recognition of the fact that what the electorate has seen deserves your respect. But the second reason was indeed what he said. Particularly in the latter part of the campaign, and then immediately after being elected, he made a number of conciliatory and I would say even inclusive sounding statements. The reiteration of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas was part of it. The other part of it was explicitly saying things like, I will be a Prime Minister for all Indians and don't worry about the things you've heard about me and so on. And the Constitution is my only holy book and that kind of talk. So it certainly left one with the impression that we had somebody here who was, to put it very bluntly, seeming to be willing to change his spots. So I wrote an article at the time, which was, of course, much misrepresented, as everything I say or do tends to be, in which I said...
You've got the scorpion's bite, right?
For example. So I said, is there a Modi 2.0? And though the article actually specifically concluded with the point, it's too early to tell, I was attacked for asking the question in the first place, as if that was heresy. And I felt that was unreasonable because, in fact, if somebody is willing to signal a different sort of persona, surely we should give him the opportunity to demonstrate that he can live up to that. And so I said, you know, Mr. Modi's own words are establishing the yardstick by which he should be judged in future. That is, that the yardstick is laid by his own statements of who he is and what he's going to be doing. And then if you say you haven't lived up to your own promises, you're on better ground than if you continue demonizing him for his previous transgressions. And so that was my logic. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I mean, essentially, within a short while, I'm afraid the disenchantment began because Mr. Modi showed very little sign of actually living up to all of that. I still remember within a week or two of his election, of his swearing in, there was this horrific episode in Pune when a young techie coming out of a mosque and looking visibly Muslim was beaten to death by a mob calling itself the Hindu Sena, with hockey sticks and truncheons. And he had done absolutely nothing. It was simply they were looking for a Muslim to kill. And the sense that there were a whole set of unsavory elements like that who were emboldened and even feeling empowered by the Modi victory was dismaying. So I was then briefly a Congress spokesman, and I publicly called on the Prime Minister to repudiate this, to condemn this killing, and to send an explicit signal that this is not what his victory is about, that he has no intention of empowering gundas in the name of Hindutva, and that that condign punishment for them must be meted out in order to send a very clear and unambiguous signal
to others. What was his response?
His response was silence. And that precisely laid the tone for all the future incidents in which horrific things happened and the Prime Minister greeted it with silence. In fact, just to complete the thought, in the end of 2014, so 6 months after he'd come to power, I published a collection of essays called India Shastra. And in that I wrote a covering essay reflecting on these 6 months, and I said, there's a contradiction at the heart of Mr. Modi's prime ministership. He says all these liberal things, all these inclusive things, but he clearly rests for support for political viability on the most illiberal elements in Indian society. And therefore, I said, this illiberality versus his professions of inclusive growth and so on, in this lie the seeds of his future failure. Which is why, 5 years later, publishing this book, I was able to begin it with the words, "I told you so."
So, Shashi, it would be hard to dispute. It's interesting you've broken the book up into sort of 5 clusters, looking at his economics, looking at his inclusiveness, social inclusiveness and communalism, looking at his governance record, looking at his foreign policy, and him as a person, And I'll come to addressing perhaps each of that if we go very fast on it. But what is very, very interesting is that when you were analyzing what his impact on us has been, you've used this idea of a kind of, not so much fascism as fear, a climate of fear that has been created, which is just short of fascism. And so you really can't call it out as fascism, and yet it is beginning to have similar impacts. Can you talk about that? What is that infrastructure that has been created?
Well, it's certainly, you speak of a climate of fear, that's partly true. The larger part is a climate of intimidation. There are many who voluntarily succumb, I'm afraid, to being put down or to being obliged to cooperate because they are intimidated. They are perhaps terrified of consequences that may come their way. And the other thing that's striking is the extent to which there are, for example, in our society, are rather craven media institutions that have felt it entirely appropriate to enable the BJP's messaging, that will oblige, if I'm to take my own case today, will oblige a willful distortion of what I have said and continue to hammer away at it. They just did it a week ago, another remark of mine, until finally people like me are going to say, why speak in public at all if this is what the whole thing is going to be reduced to? So it's not only fear, it is also the creation of an atmosphere of complicity, of intimidation, and in part of fear that, again, particularly affects those who are avowed critics of the government and particularly those of minorities. I've been horrified when rather well-placed friends, people who had enjoyed very prominent positions in Indian government and business, said to me, and I had 3 separate conversations one day with 3 separate people who all said variants of this, which is, we're going to keep our head down, we're not going to speak out. You say what you like, they'll call you anti-national. But I'm Muslim, I can't afford to be anti-national. That kind of message has now, I think, sent a sort of chill down the spines of any Indian Democrat.
Shashi, I'm going to come back and ask you later for the attributes of what is short of fascist, administration, and maybe you can spell that out. But before that, some of the ball of this goes back into the Congress court. And, I was doing a session with Kapil Sibal recently and put these questions to him that Harsh Mander, recently said something that I think the Congress really has to take home to itself, which is that he too has been around the country speaking to Muslim communities, and he said whereas the BJP has made the Muslim voter irrelevant, the Congress has made the Muslim voter untouchable, you know. Would you take that on as fair criticism? And what is the Congress position on the Muslim voter? You know, you've had reports where basically, you know, Anthony Report has asked the party to jettison the Muslim constituency as an obvious vote bank, because everyone now is afraid to just look at them as equal citizens.
Well, actually, what's interesting is that to some degree, all politics is local. And I don't know where my good friend Harsh traveled. He's not just my friend, but a childhood friend, a classmate. And I have enormous respect for him. But it's certainly not true in Kerala, which is where I have my karma bhumi, where I do my grassroots politicking, because there is not just great respect for the Muslim community as voters, as citizens, and indeed as constituent stakeholders in the political enterprise that is the Indian Republic, but also there is a great deal of shall we say, inclusiveness on the part of the majority community and other communities towards everyone, so that even though, for example, in my constituency, Muslims are only 10% of the population, I speak openly about the importance of secularism and inclusiveness to audiences that are largely non-Muslim and receive sustained applause and support.
What about your party?
I mean, I speak as a party MP, and I find no particular problem with any of my party colleagues in Kerala. Now, I don't know whether in parts of the Hindi-speaking north this has changed a bit. I know that certainly Congress leaders, including myself, have been accused of speaking up or advertising our Hindu faith in order to neutralize some of the claims of the BJP to being the only party that speaks up for Hindu interests and the Hindu population, which is utter nonsense. There are Hindus in every party, just as there are in the BJP, except that we believe in Hinduism and not in Hindutva, which has really nothing to do with Hinduism, but rather with a political ideology that seeks to marginalize other communities.
So, you know, to come back to, let's actually first get this scorpion bit out of the way, because there may be many in the audience who didn't hear you say what you said, and we're always saying that the media distorts it. So why don't you actually say what you said the RSS feels about Modi? Put out the metaphor for what it was.
The RSS feels about Modi.
Someone in the RSS.
I said that what we see about Modi is that there is something called Moditva, which is Hindutva plus Modi. So you've got the Hindutva philosophy in which he was schooled from a very young age. He has been an RSS pracharak, and as late as the year before the elections, I think he published a book of 16 heroes' lives, and all 16 were male members of the RSS. I mean, it's as simple as that. This is the world in which he has emerged from. At the same time, that there is something about the Modi personality cult that goes beyond Hindutva alone, and that makes the RSS comfortable. You know, in researching the first 86 pages of the book, which are sort of an extended profile of the man, his beliefs, his conduct, his life, etc., and I did a lot of secondary research, but the secondary research involved people citing primary sources. We had quotes from, for example, RSS workers saying that when Modi was a young pracharak, the then Sarsang Chalak Golwalkar upbraided him publicly for keeping a neatly trimmed beard when all the other pracharaks were supposed to be clean-shaven, this sort of thing. And so there were these attacks on his individuality and his desire to really draw attention to himself personally, which is part of a personality trait that many others in other parties have, nothing wrong with it, but which in the case of an RSS pracharak is relatively unusual. It's a very self-effacing organization otherwise. And so at the end of the day, I said that Moditva is something that is Hindutva plus. It's not Hindutva minus, it's Hindutva plus. But that plus involves a number of things to do with his personal leadership, his personality, his own personal
We're going to run out of time. So what was the metaphor you used that got you into?
Therefore, some in the RSS are uncomfortable with this. And as I said, there was a very interesting metaphor used by an unnamed RSS source in speaking to the journalist and editor Vinod Jose of The Caravan, who said that, and this is a 2012 article, it's not about today, and I stress that I believe when I quoted the metaphor, it's about the lead up to Modi's anointment as Prime Minister. He said that, that Modi is like a scorpion sitting on a shivling. You cannot remove it with your hand, and you cannot hit it with a chappal.
Yeah.
Now, this, not my metaphor, somebody else's, but certainly, as you will agree, worth quoting.
It's a very apt one. You're almost wishing that you were the author of it.
I think BJP wishes I was the author of it because they've been going to town all day accusing me of insulting the Hindu religion, wanting to take chappals to shivlings, God knows what else. And the media obligingly playing to them. I gather there are 7 debates this evening on what is not even my statement. So I'm just tired
your
of
secondary utterances. You know.
I'm sorry?
I said there's 7 debates on your secondary utterances.
Well, in this particular case, as in the last time around, a complete out of context distortion of what I said. But the metaphor is still interesting. And
so
I'm
now,
glad to share it with you.
So now, Shashi, say something here which will actually deserve debate, you know, and I'm going to pose that question to you. But I must say, in all fairness, that it really is a point of reflection when a metaphor like that is taken as an insult to Shivling and to Shiva, and Rahul Gandhi is now called upon to explain his devotion to Shiva because of an RSS quote about a scorpion on a Shiva, you know. It truly tells you...
And that the media so obligingly plays along with it.
Yes, and I must say that right here, the only culprit seems to be the media, not even Modi, not the scorpion, not the RSS, and not you. You know?
No, I think my dear friend Ravi Shankar Prasad, who is often in error but never in doubt, held a press conference in which he promptly, you know, ascribed all manner of things to me and indeed demanded that apology and so on, which I'm not going to give him. So we'll see how far that goes. But, you know, one of the interesting things, you know, a metaphor that occurred to me about this whole experience was something that everyone advises NRIs when they come back to India, which is that in India, remember, the rule of the road is not to drive carefully so you don't hit somebody else. Drive so carefully that nobody else can hit you. And that's what happened to me in Indian politics. Clearly, I'm not driving well enough.
Okay. So, Shashi, we'll come back to the criticism of Modi, which your entire book really does very empirically, which is what was interesting. You really marshaled a lot of facts and figures, uncontrovertible, you know, many of them from Parliament records. So I'll give you a chance to elaborate on all of that. But first up, you know, if we today accept that the economy is in a bit of a shambles, definitely the communal heat is up. Everyone, I think, is very, very upset about the lynchings. A large majority of Hindus would be uncomfortable with it. Why is the Congress and the opposition still in such disarray, you know? Why do we all feel that the country still doesn't have the kind of multi-politics that it deserves, and we're still looking at a Tina factor? What is it that you all need to introspect about and haven't got around to doing?
I'm just not sure that's fair, but I can't disagree that that seems to be the perception. Actually, I find the opposition has been very active on all these issues. We have been active on the communal issue. We've been active on the price rise issue. I've lost count of the number of speeches I must have made in my constituency and elsewhere about the fact that gas cylinders that were 390 a cylinder in UPA rule are now up at 970, or that the price you pay at the petrol pump that goes straight to the government, that is the excise duty per litre of petrol, which was 392 under the UPA, has gone up to 1948, and that this is absolute highway robbery on the part of the government. We've said all of this. We've talked about pretty much every issue, and now Rahul Gandhi has, I think, made a fairly significant impact by highlighting the abuses and the abuses and the failures and the dangers inherent in the Rafale scam. Well, let me address that right away. You all remember, if you're old enough, and I guess some of you were children then, the assiduous media coverage on the Bofors scam, which was apparently the entire deal was worth 84 crores. Some portion of it was allegedly siphoned off, and as you know, to this day, no proof has been found that anything was, but it essentially brought down the government of Rajiv Gandhi, and there was daily coverage. Rafale is a deal worth 45,000 crores. What's more, there are some fundamental questions that this government has never bothered to answer and that they've been let off the hook on. Number one, if your Air Force determines after a 6-year study that it needs 128 aircraft, why does Mr. Modi come back having signed a surprising deal for just 36? Second, if there is a requirement that these aircraft be made and manufactured in France for parts and an agreement that they will then be assembled in India by the HAL in Bangalore, a public sector company. Why did they suddenly become 36 aircraft fully manufactured in France
Shashi,
in a flyaway condition?
I'm just going to...
And the offset contract to be given to a private company whose head, who's never made a plane, travels with Mr. Modi to Paris. These are questions that Rahul Gandhi has asked. And,
Shashi,
my point is simply this. My point is simply this. There are serious issues of national security that the opposition has raised.
Just hold on a minute. May I just ask you, please not to intervene like that, because the idea of algebra is courteous dialogue, and it also means the capacity to listen, even when you're not agreeing with the speaker. And I am cutting him in, not because the Rafale deal is not an important...
I believe it's an issue and that the opposition has placed it on the national agenda.
It is an important issue to discuss. The only reason I'm cutting in is because the points you're making really are very strongly out there in the public domain. So it's not something new that we can add to the audience, you know.
So you only want new scorpions?
New scorpions, yes. But, so again, as I said, I'm going to come back to Mr. Modi and your criticism because of the factual way in which you've gone about it. But before that, let's momentarily move to Nehru, you know. There are many faults that are lying at the Congress doorstep today, Shashi. I think it is really a travesty that today many generations who don't remember what the founding fathers did for this, and founding, you know, it's awkward to use the word mothers, but basically the founding leaders of this country did for this country. Why is what Nehru meant allowed to become so travestized, and the Congress can do nothing about it? You know, there is no pushback. Today, you've written a book on Mr. Modi, you've written a book on Nehru. But what would you say to convince this audience that Mr. Nehru was one of the greatest leaders that this country could have and should have had in 1947? What would you say?
Well, I'm also pleased to say that the book is being reissued by Penguin 15 years after it was first published, and that will be happening on the day of his birthday this year, in fact, the day before, the 13th. But let me also stress that I was myself, in many ways, a critic of Nehru. And when I was asked to write this biography, I started off far from being an uncritical admirer. I was somebody who had real misgivings about some of his choices and policies. But the more I read of him, read of his times, saw of his mind and the sincerity and dedication with which he applied himself, I realized we owed him far more than most of us realized. One particular thing we genuinely owe him is our democracy. And I think we're going to see it all the more as the institutions he so painstakingly built up are being hollowed out by the present government. You look now at a number of things we take for granted. Back in 1947, the country was in disarray. The flames of partition were blazing across the land. 1 million people had been butchered. 13 million had been displaced. It would have been very easy at that point to say we need a firm hand to quell all this and to guide the nation forward. Nehru and the leaders around him chose democracy. By 1948 January, Mahatma Gandhi was dead. By 1950 December, Sardar Patel was dead. Essentially, there was no giant left to challenge Nehru. He could have essentially, arguing precisely the challenges of development and so on, he could have done what so many other ex-colonial leaders in other developing countries did, including the great names of Nkrumah and Nyerere and so on in Africa. He could have simply said, democracy is a luxury we can't afford. So pulling my people out of poverty, educating them, and so on is far more important. He actually had the decency to say, no, we have to do all that. We have to pull our people out of poverty, we have to educate them, but we will do it through democracy. This is a man who, after his huge popularity in the 1937 election campaign, authored an anonymous attack upon himself, published an article saying, this man enjoys popular adulation too much. We want no Caesars. We must resist the temptation of giving this man power. And later it turned out he was the author himself of the article. And people realized that he was essentially issuing a warning, institutions are more important than individuals. And afterwards, everything from the way in which he attended Parliament, gave an importance out of all proportion to the numerically tiny opposition, the way in which he showed public respect to the president and the vice president who outranked him in ceremonial terms, the way in which, when challenged, even within the cabinet, his instinct was always to offer to resign rather than to assert his authority, the way in which he once, because he was also a hot-tempered man, said something intemperate about a judge. And by the end of the day, he wrote a craven letter of apology to the judge he'd offended, and then a letter to the Chief Justice of India apologizing for having inadvertently insulted the judiciary. Nehru didn't need to do that, and you can never imagine Narendra Modi doing that.
So what about
But
the
fact
allegation
is,
that Mr.
these were ways of building up the institutions that today we can cherish and value. What do we have? We have an era in the last 4 years in which, sadly, every precious institution has been called into question. The Supreme Court, the CBI, the CVC, the CIC, the Right to Information Act, the Election Commission. You name the institution that hasn't, in one way or the other, had questions being raised about it.
And so address the criticism that Mr. Modi recently launched, which was that governments prior to him looked at India and governed India through British glasses. You know, what would you say in defense of that?
Well, I think that's a charge that I certainly would be exempt from, because I look at the British through very angry Indian glasses myself.
In a British accent.
No. Look, I just happen to have a good year. This is the English I was taught by Indian teachers in Bombay in the early 60s and at St. Stephen's College in Delhi. Others perhaps were less influenced by their teachers than I was.
Unfortunately, we don't have the time to joust, Shashi, so carry on.
I just want to tell you that...
Take the criticism.
I hope that pretty much any language I speak it in the appropriate accent to that language. So.
Yes.
And that goes for French as well, and Malayalam, in which I campaign all the time in Kerala. Yeah. And in my...
I did. I caveated...
So you can withdraw your remark.
I caveated all my repartees with saying that you're a polymath and each issue deserves a 1-hour conversation, but I need you to rush on this, Shashi.
No, I just think that, you know, this whole business about the English, the one charge that I myself have voiced is that we essentially took over the British colonial state and didn't reinvent it. And I've said this in the past, this was a choice that was made. There were too many disruptions already. And Nehru and Patel, and to some degree Gandhiji too, I think, accepted the idea that this was a transfer of power rather than a revolution or an upending of the British colonial order. The problem manifests itself in that. But in those elements, Mr. Modi hasn't done anything different. Where is the police reform, for example, which successive governments, Congress, BJP and others, have failed to undertake, so that a police force schooled in the colonial era continues to conduct itself in that way. I think the one credit one can give the Congress is for creating institutions the British had never created and would never have created,
which
because
is
they
the
were
Panchayat,
not. Such as the ones I mentioned, such as the Panchayati Raj, such as the various independent investigating agencies, such as the Election Commission itself, the Right to Information Act. A number of things have been created which are intrinsic to a democracy and would not have existed in a colonial state. But those things the British created in the colonial era could have been reinvented, rethought, and perhaps everyone is equally guilty of not having done that.
So, Shashi, you know, because we are attempting a very large canvas of conversation, so I'm going to kind of be a bit of a grasshopper, and I want to come back to this conversation when it's really at the heart of the debate between what, say, the Congress era stood for and what the BJP era stands for, when they say that they want to infuse Indian government now with the Hindu ethos, you know, and Deen Dayal Upadhyay, who's really their mentor, speaks about tearing down the constitution and really creating a new constitution which imbibes the Hindu ethos. And how is that different from the constitution that we all live by and respect today? So I want to come back to that. But before that, because we started on Mr. Modi, one of the things that he's really respected for and was admired for by the electorate that voted for him was his rhetoric, you know. The most trenchant criticism in your book is, in fact, when you take him on his rhetoric with facts. Will you spell some of those out? So not just criticism in the air, spell out some of the stark statistics that you feel puts Mr. Modi in his place.
Well, given how little time we have, I think literally the book is hundreds of footnotes, so you can delve into it and see for yourself. But across the board, the claims that Mr. Modi makes, right from having won the support of 600 crore voters, for example, right down to some of the specific claims about electrification of villages, the success of extending broadband internet into the rural areas and so on. These are propaganda flung out without any serious regard.
So take on the 600 crore voters. Why don't we spell it out?
Because the fact is the entire country is only 120 million people, and about 57 million of them voted, which is about 5.7 crores. You know, 570 million voted, which is about 57 crores. It's not 600 crores, but it's as if the numbers don't matter. If it sounds good, he'll say it. He's also gone and parked.
Just to put that in perspective, 600 crore people would be 6 billion, which is pretty much the entire planet voting for Mr. Modi.
Voted for Mr. Modi, exactly. Or
when actually 17.5 crore people, 31% of the 86 crore that voted, 31% of that would be 17.5 crore people that actually
voted for him.
Voted for Mr.
Precisely,
Modi.
quite so. But I mean, 5.57 crores voted for the entire election for all parties, and of that about 17.5 voted for him. Now that's one example, and I've given several others in the book, where he plays fast and loose with the facts, and something which would trouble anyone who was taken in by the message. This is somebody who's a modern-minded, high-tech friendly, sort of business oriented person, because in fact when he sits in Silicon Valley and gives some of these figures and they actually don't make sense, it can be rather worrying. It's also worrying when he has a cavalier disregard for history. So he'll go to a place and say, this is the location when, and he names 3 great sages from that area to show he's familiar, where they all sat and talked. Well, the fact is they were born several centuries apart, so they couldn't have sat and talked. Or he goes to Bihar and talks about the glories of Takshila, which happens to be in modern-day Pakistan. But all of these things, there is a sort of...
But I think he also told Mark Zuckerberg that we are an $8 trillion economy when we are a $2.5 trillion economy.
That's right, and that's precisely the Silicon Valley example I was thinking of. I didn't want to drown the audience in bad numbers, but the fact is that either he doesn't really have a sense of what these numbers are, what they mean, numbers, dates, facts, and figures, or he just doesn't care, and neither is particularly reassuring in a prime minister.
So, Shashi, again, I'm not going to go into it because much of the demonetization, the communal incidents, the lynching, everyone in the audience knows, so I'm not really going to give you a...
What about the Ganesh head as an evidence of plastic surgery? You know that one, don't you? Where Mr. Modi makes a speech where he says that the fact that we have Lord Ganesh is proof of the fact that ancient India conducted plastic surgery. Now, there are 2 things wrong with that. The first is that, of course, if you just paused and thought for about 30 seconds, you know that the smallest imaginable elephant head could not possibly fit on the largest imaginable human neck. I mean, you can think of the fattest person you know and the smallest baby elephant whose picture you've seen, and you know it's not possible. He hasn't applied his mind to that thought. But the worst thing about this, as a fan of ancient India myself, is that actually by saying this, he discredits the truth, which is that ancient India did invent plastic surgery. That we have records going back to the 1st century AD. The world's first rhinoplasty operation was conducted by Shushruta to reconstruct a broken nose, and the records of that exist in ancient palm leaf manuscripts whose authenticity has been confirmed. The ancient instruments, the oldest surgical instruments ever found in the world, were found from ancient India. Now, this would have been a true story to be proud of. Instead, by saying this absurd fantasy about Lord Ganesha, you end up conflating the sort of addled minds of the Hindutva apologists who have jet engines in the Vedic age and who have atomic technology in the Mahabharata, who have GPS in the Mahabharata, because how could Sanjay have told the story to Rashtra without the internet? I mean, we had invented the internet 3,000. All of this has been said by not just Mr. Modi was the Ganesh example. The other examples I gave you are by a certified chief minister of the BJP
in fact, we had Dr. Subramaniam Swamy at Algebra in Chennai, and we challenged him on what the Education Minister of State said, where he said that he wants Darwin's theory kicked out of all school books because he said, our Nana Nani have never told us that they went to the jungle and saw apes evolving into man, So that's the Education Minister of State of India. And the Rajasthan Education Minister said that all cows should be worshipped because they exhale oxygen, when the truth is that they exhale 300 kgs of methane, which is equivalent to 2,500 kgs of carbon dioxide. And Vijay Rupani, the Chief Minister of Gujarat, went to an infrastructure conference where the chairman of ISRO was sitting there, and he said Lord Ram was the first missile nuclear scientist because of the arrows that he was shooting in the Ramayana. And Dr. Swamy, who is a Harvard graduate, one of the youngest people to get a PhD from Harvard, said that, yes, maybe I don't keep very high intellectual company, you know. And I must say in your defense, because I cut you out on the Rafale deal, that Dr. Subramaniam Swamy also said that if the Congress and Rahul Gandhi had not picked up the Rafale deal, he would have, but he doesn't want to help the Congress, so he isn't shooting at his own government, you know. So maybe you have the wrong ally. But anyway, Shashi, so we've given you enough.
That man.
Oh, I forgot. His Sicilian revenge is focused on you. I forgot about that, yeah. But Shashi, I've given you enough platform now to give some indication of what criticism you've been levying at Mr. Modi. But the criticism...
No, that's only a fragment of the criticism.
Only a fragment. You've written a book. We have only 5 more minutes. But in all of that, Shashi, if his administration has been as deplorable and as short in promise as it is, or as it portends to be, or as you claim it is, why is the electorate not still turning towards the Congress? And I would ask you to tell this audience that you might be convincing them on why they don't and should not like Mr. Modi, but what are you going to say to them about why they should like you? And when I say you, I mean the Congress. What do you have going for you that any electorate should be voting for you?
Well, I think 2 things. First of all, of course, there is the basic argument that this lot doesn't deserve a second innings. And that is an argument that we've been making.
That's not convincing for why we should vote for you.
I agree. So that's the first part of the argument, and that can't be wished away. Because they don't have anything to point to. Achhe din have not come for anybody. But the second side of the argument is that we can do better because we have done better. That if you look at the record of the Congress Party, including, no, I'm sorry, we have. And you know, we can, the best and most sustained periods of economic growth in India have come under Congress rule. The most significant advances in expanding human freedoms have come under Congress rule, including things like the RTI. The Congress has never intimidated the press, never sought to stifle democracy since the emergency, which I myself condemned at the time. And I would add that if you look at the Congress Party of today, it has a certain humility about it, which I think is rather healthy, because on the one hand, you've got Mr. Modi as the hero on the white stallion, with his upraised sword saying, I know all the answers, I will solve all the problems, I'll cut through all the Gordian knots. And we've seen how badly that's worked out for 4.5 years. Whereas on the other side, you have people saying, we're coming on foot, we're not on a white horse, we don't have an upraised sword, and maybe we don't know all the answers. But you know what? We'll listen to your questions. We'll understand your issues, and we'll come with a deep and experienced bench strength of qualified people who have experience of government, unlike most of the people who are now trying to run the government, and who will therefore work with you to solve your problems, as we have done before. Now that, to my mind, is as compelling an argument as we can make. Plus, there are the substantive arguments, the fact that we stand for an inclusive India, that no one is going to demonize minorities on our watch, that we will cater to the interests of the underprivileged, the women, the Adivasis, and others, that we will stand up for the interests of all and not just of one religiously defined community, that we will certainly can be trusted with economic growth, but we will also distribute the fruits of that growth, the revenues of economic growth, to those who can't afford.
So Shashi, tell me, and you know, again, I would look partisan. So again, it's not because of the Congress, but certainly one's commitment to democratic principles of, you know, right to information, right to education. That it was very interesting because we had, you know, Bimal Jalan and James Crabtree at an Algebra event recently, and both of them really coming from a worldview which is of the market economy. But both their books say that for India to really head anywhere, what we absolutely and, you know, almost inarguably need is a welfare state and a delivery of a welfare state and a state that cares about social justice. So it was interesting coming from them. So I'm saying we can't argue with the fact that these were things that the Congress did. But I'm very interested in the booing that the Congress faces by audiences like this. And clearly there's been a vote of no confidence from pretty much the entire country. What have you introspected about that, Shashi? Right now, you faced a lot of booing. What is creating that booing?
Was that booing for me? No, I thought...
When I say you, I don't mean you. Speak for your party. Maybe was it for him? Put your hands up.
All right, well, so let me address that. I think Rahul Gandhi's biggest problem actually is the fact of his name, is the fact that he comes from a particular family and that many of you feel that he is in that position because of his... now, I don't disagree that he needs to earn that authority, but you have to give him the chance. As an opposition leader, he has been out there with every interest group in this country, and he has been trying to see and identify with causes that this government has neglected.
Shashi. Sorry, I'm going to ask the audience to be please to be a disciplined classroom, because I think your negative emotion towards Rahul Gandhi has been registered. Let him take that on and answer that criticism.
No, I mean, he himself has said that he's conscious of the fact that dynasty is not a good thing and that he's there because of who he is, but it's also true that unfortunately that is in many ways the way in which our country works. The number of political parties have managed themselves in exactly the same way, whether it's the Samajwadi,
but Shashi, don't trot out the official line.
Let me just finish the argument.
I'll tell you why.
Look, ours is a country where the sons of Bollywood stars become Bollywood stars.
That's not a convincing
Does
argument.
acting talent go that way? Look, I'm not saying that's the only argument. Wait a minute. I'm just saying opportunities in this country. Look, I can say this with pride. My father wasn't a politician. My sons are not going to be politicians. So I have chosen a profession because I believe it's the best way for me to articulate my contribution to the national discourse and to the directions in which this country might go. That's my role in politics. But I'm very conscious that I'm extremely untypical. That very, very many of my political colleagues have done nothing else but politics all their lives, and many of them come from families that are proud of the fact that they've been politicians all their lives. That is the nature, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, of our country. It's not typical of any other democracy, but it is true of us. It's true across parties.
Shashi,
and people who are purely selfless
may I use the moderator's prerogative and cut you in?
You've been doing it already. Go ahead.
I have. I was warning you that you're going to run out of time, and we didn't even touch upon the constitution and the whole idea of Hinduism.
Let's do it. Let's keep people waiting 2 minutes longer.
No. We don't have time. We have a lot of sessions coming up. But just to leave this thought with you, that the whole point about Rahul Gandhi, the defense that the Congress puts out about dynasty is not a convincing one. And I think part of the booing comes out of the fact that very honest introspection is not happening. You need to communicate better. It's very interesting that it is Congress politics, given that you rule this country.
Let me tell you, there is not a shadow of a doubt that if tomorrow there were a free and fair election amongst the Congress workers of all of India for the leader of the party, you can put up any congressman you know and can name against Rahul Gandhi will win hands down. The party wants him. The party wants him. The DNA of the party workers, as it were, is inextricably tied up with the Gandhi-Nehru mystique. Now, whether you like it or not, it's a reality. But what I'm talking about is when you, or someone in my position, has to identify with a political vehicle that comes closest to advancing the liberal ideas and the inclusive ideas that I hold dear, and the ideas of social justice and the ideas of essentially competent governance, I find no party closer than the Congress party to where I am. And to my mind, the fact that it happens to be a party that is definitely very strongly loyal to a family is, to my mind, secondary to the values it espouses and the principles it seeks to uphold. The day the Congress ceases to be a party of those ideals, people like me will not support it. But the ideals, the values, the principles, and trying to deliver on those for the country are why I'm in politics. And to my mind, the fact that somebody is leading the party from a particular family is, to my mind, much less relevant than the effectiveness of the party on getting its message out to the people and bringing positive change to the country.
You know, unfortunately, we've run out of time. If you promise to give it in one line, I'm going to ask you the one question that really matters, which is this whole debate about the Constitution. If in 2019 the BJP comes back with a greater majority, there is the sense that it will change the Constitution, because it has been a stated desire of the RSS. But recently, it's very interesting that Mohan Bhagwat, in his, what Ram Madhav called the glasnost speech, really articulated a different vision of Hindutva, where he says Hindutva means nothing without Muslims, and all the other points he made, which I'm sure the audience is familiar with. Do you think that the genius of India is forcing even the RSS to rethink itself, to remain in power? Because beyond a point, this country will not tolerate a majoritarian ethos. And I strongly believe that. Do you believe
Well,
that?
I hope the country will prove that by the way it votes in the election. Because the fact is there are a number of dismaying signs already. We haven't changed our constitution to create a Hindu Rashtra, but there are very many non-Hindus who already feel that they have been somehow reduced to second-class citizenship in our country. I don't think it's true yet fully in practical terms, but it's not just the changing of a constitution or the rewriting of it or dropping the word secular, which to my mind really doesn't matter. What matters is the way in which you interpret and apply the spirit of the Constitution, which is, at bottom, a fundamentally inclusive Constitution that respects both collective rights and individual rights of citizens, and that makes sure that every citizen feels equally valued and equally powerful in this country. Today, that's under threat. Now, if you vote these people into office, certainly pre the Mohan Bhagwat speech, they had never backed away from the idea that a Hindu Rashtra was their objective, and that would mean that this would be a country with a constitution only for the Hindus, and the others, however defined, would either be treated as guests or as interlopers. We've already seen the very surprisingly neglected development of this government openly saying that refugees from neighboring countries will be accepted so long as they're not Muslim. So they've spelled out the various other religions that's acceptable, and they have actually violated every international principle imaginable by returning 7 Rohingya refugees to Myanmar. Now, this, to my mind, is already a very ominous sign. It implies somehow that if you're Muslim, you are less entitled to asylum in India, a home in India, and a future in India than if you belong to some other faith. To my mind, that's deeply worrying because it's a different understanding of what India is all about from the understanding with which we all grew up in this country and which is enshrined in the Constitution.
Thank you very much, Shashi. You know, even as we sort of look at politics as a gladiatorial battle between the Congress and the BJP and other parties, I do hope that platforms like this are a point of reflection that, you know, this really pertains to all of us. And when you look at what Deen Dayal Upadhyay, which is really the mentor of the BJP, says about the Constitution and the idea of nationalism, I'd just like to leave us with one thought, which is that we all live with that idea that anybody who geographically lives in this country is a citizen. Whereas they don't believe that. They believe in the idea of cultural nationalism, that only those who are Hindus are deserving to be citizens of this country. And it's a sobering thought that many of us Hindus are not deemed Hindu enough. And America under Trump is a good example of which way that philosophy can go when people begin to put out certificates of who's national enough and Hindu enough and kosher enough to remain a citizen of a country that we all love. So even as we mock Modi and mock Rahul Gandhi and mock Shashi in part, it is important to remember that they really are fighting very, very big public battles that pertain to all of us. Thank you very, very much, Shashi.
Thank you, Shoma. Thank you all.